All right, everybody. We are going to add to our sort of roster of non-harmonic tones. We've talked about the passing tone and the neighbor tone. And we saw that both of those were fairly easy to add to the texture, right? We were taking notes that were not part of the chords and using them to sort of fill in, really sort of easy to find spaces. So with the passing tone, we were filling in the skip of a third. If we had C to E, we could go C to E. Even if D isn't in the chord, it makes sense in that spot because of its relationship in that melodic line. Right? Same thing with the neighbor tone. If I had a melody that went E E, I could do a neighbor tone E D E or E F E. And again, it's just sort of fitting into that line, and it's not really getting in the way of much, right? We're adding a little bit of interest, and we saw that adding these non-harmonic tones is a really, really, really effective and simple way to really ramp up the sort of interest in the texture, adds these sort of new unexpected vertical intervallic relationships, and it just can make the melodies a little bit more singable, a little bit more nuanced. But they don't do too much to really draw a lot of attention to themselves or disrupt anything, which is one of their main strengths. What we're going to talk about today, though, is a type of non-harmonic tone that is much more, I don't want to use the word aggressive, but we'll say noticeable and hard to ignore, right? So we're going to talk about something called the suspension, which I'll say this too right before we get into it. Unlike the neighbor tone and the passing tone, we tend to be very specific about the way we understand suspensions, about the way we conceive of suspensions, and about the way we label suspensions. So that's a main difference from a technique standpoint, is that suspensions get a little bit more of a careful and specific treatment, which oftentimes can make things feel more complicated. They're not inherently that much more complicated, but the stuff that comes around them can definitely make them feel that way. I would say the biggest thing about suspensions is that they're much more noticeable in the musical texture and have a huge impact when they're used, and that kind of impact really deserves a more careful, a more specific, and a more clear notation technique. So that's sort of where that's coming from. The last thing I want to say before we really get into it is we're going to look in the notation of these, and we're going to see we're using numbers to describe them. Think about when we learned about inversion symbols, when we learned about the sort of figured bass symbols, which we use to describe inverted chords. And we know that those numbers, even though we use them as shorthand for things, like with the 6/4, for instance, those numbers literally mean that above the bass there's a sixth and there's a fourth, right? That's all that really means. We can interpret it when we see a chord that says 1/6. We know that 6 means, first inversion. But remember, that's the shorthand. The specific thing is it says there's a sixth above the bass. And so when we see these numbers with the suspensions, remember that anytime we use what's called an Arabic numeral, right, our normal numbers are Arabic numerals, as opposed to Roman numerals, which we use to denote the chords. Anytime we see an Arabic numeral, what we would call just a normal number, that refers to an interval above the bass. That's going to come up again, but I just really wanted to just get that in your mind right away. Anytime we see an Arabic numeral, it refers to an interval above the bass. Okay? Let's talk suspensions here. So the biggest difference right away from the passing tone and the neighbor tone that we've looked at so far is that suspensions are a non-chord tone or a non-harmonic tone that occurs on the strong beat. So it's metrically accented, which means that, like I said, it's going to be so much more prominent in the musical texture. Part of the thing that makes those neighbor tones and passing tones, less noticeable is that they happened on the offbeat. They weren't metrically stressed, and so they don't carry as much of an impact. Things that happen on a beat are always much more strongly felt. So the suspension, by being on a beat, automatically has a lot more of weight to it. And when we talk here, when I say that it occurs on a downbeat, what we mean is a numbered beat in a measure. So if we're in 4/4 time, it's going to be on beat 1, 2, 3, or 4. If we were in 3/4, it'd be on beat 1, 2, or 3. When I say downbeat in this context, I don't mean that the measure, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, is the only downbeat of the measure. This is just contrasting with offbeat, the 1 and 2 and 3 and, right? Okay. So, like I said, it's got a much more distinct sound than what we saw with the passing tone and the neighbor tone for a lot of reasons. And the way that it works is that we are going to see a note that's not part of the chord holding over, let me say that again. It's a note that is a part of a previous chord. This will make a lot more sense when we see the music. That's just staying a little too long. So all the other notes of that chord have moved on to something new and exciting. But that one note is just kind of hanging on just a little bit longer. I sort of like to think about it. This is the last person to leave your house after you've had like a party or a gathering or whatever. The person who's just kind of hanging out maybe a little longer than everybody else, that's the suspension. Now, in that context, maybe not so good. I would argue that in the suspension context, it's exactly what you want. So we're going to see a note holding over or suspending from one chord into a next chord where it doesn't quite belong, where it's not a member of that triad. So it's suspending, it's being held into a new chord. And that's how we get this non-harmonic element that it's, sort of at the center of its identity. Like I said, we're going to be a lot more specific as we notate these because they do have a somewhat of a situational usage. This, by and large, tends to correspond to inversions of chords. So that's some introduction. I think it'll make a lot more sense once we look at some actual examples here. So what we're going to do to start is we're going to talk about the sort of musical context in which we might find a suspension or be able to use a suspension. And we're going to look at a really stripped down version of it with only 2 voices because it's a lot more clear that way. So we've talked about what kind of spots we would be looking for in order to use a passing tone and a neighbor tone. We know that passing tones were filling in the space of a third. Neighbor tones are ornamenting a repeated note. So I could do, right? With a suspension, we're looking for motion of a downwards second, right? So if we saw motion of a downwards second, right? That's a spot where we could consider using a suspension. And what's going to happen is, even though I just did 2 notes here, note 1, note 2, we know that any non-harmonic tone has 3 parts. The preparation, the non-harmonic tone, which in this case is the suspension, and the resolution. Since in a suspension we are holding a note, we're keeping a note longer than we expect it to be there. The preparation, the first note, and the actual dissonant non-harmonic tone, the suspension, which is the second note of the thing, will be the same pitch, right? So instead of like a passing tone where we've got preparation, passing tone, resolution, in a suspension we've got preparation in the chord, right? And then we're going to have suspension. Here it's the same note being held over, and resolution, right? So the preparation and the suspension here is the same note. We're holding a note over. right? And so to do that, we're often going to see a tie used to sort of keep it there. Again, when we get to this two-voice texture, this will be even more clear. The preparation and the resolution need to be consonant, right? So we go from a note in the chord to something that's not in the chord, and we finally get to a place where all the notes are back in the chord. And this is a subtle point here, but I think this is one of the things that really makes the sort of artistry of a suspension really, really, really come to the light. The resolution, the note that we're getting to at the end here, should not be doubled, meaning we don't want another voice to be singing the note that we're going to try to get to. And again, that'll start to make more sense. This is sort of a scenario that I think of as you don't want to ruin the punchline of a joke before you get there. The whole idea with these suspensions is that we can hear where this note wants to go, right? We can hear its oops. Talk about not being in the chord. Here we can tell where it's going. You don't want someone to be like, "Do you mean that note? Is that the note you're talking about?" Right? You don't want that to be doubled because you want the sort of motion of the suspension to be the thing that carries it there. So, let's talk first about the initial type of suspension called the 4-3 suspension. And again, like I said when we were starting, any time that we see these numbers, 4-3 in this case, we're referring to intervals above the bass. Anytime we see Arabic numerals like this, we're referring to intervals above the bass. So keep that in mind. Okay, here we go. This is the two-voice texture that we're talking about. So if we start here, this is very straightforward. That's what we've got. Magnificent, right? So if we look at this, we said that a suspension, to make that work, we need motion of a downwards second. And so we've only got two voices here. We can see that the bass or the lower voice is jumping a fifth, so it's probably not going to be them. But the upper voice goes from C to B. That's a downwards second. And so we can find that descent of a second. And what we're going to do is we're going to suspend, we're going to hold that first note into the place where the second chord starts, right? So we can see here in this top example, the C is a half note, just like both voices here are on a half note. And then it moves to a B over the G half note. But the C, when we add a suspension, is just holding over. It's being suspended over top of the G, right? I sort of think of this if you think about those old, like the old Roadrunner cartoons with Wile E. Coyote. I'm assuming you know this reference. I think of this. This is Wile E. Coyote who's chasing the Roadrunner, and there's that moment where Wile E. Coyote will run off the edge of the cliff. And just sort of, there's that beautiful moment where he hasn't, or I think Wile E. Coyote's a man, who knows, sort of doesn't realize that the cliff, that the land is gone, and is just suspending there, and then he looks around and sees that he's over thin air. That's this note, and then he falls down, right? So this is sort of that same moment, maybe slightly less dramatic, fewer Acme anvils than in the Roadrunner. But this was our original. What we're going to do here is when the bass moves, the sopranos are still on C. Hear that dissonance there? I'll play it again. And this is where, think back to Theory 1, where we talked about how a fourth is a dissonant note. And we said it's not dissonant in the way that that's dissonant. It's not clashy. Dissonance means it's something that needs or wants to resolve. And I think this 4-3 suspension is such a good example of that. because it's here, and when it's hanging out over top of this note, it wants to resolve, right? We can hear how that fourth wants to resolve down to the third, right? So this is a suspension. The preparation is the first note that is held into the next chord so that it becomes a dissonant suspension over the bass, and then it resolves to the note that should have been there all along, which in this case was a third above the bass, right? So it resolves from being a fourth above the bass, fourth above the bass, down to being a third above the bass. And this is where, again, in this example, there are only two voices. So when we say, oh, yeah, of course it's a fourth, G up to C, duh. But when we add in all four voices, it's sometimes can be tough to immediately remember what voice relationships are these numbers talking about. There's a lot of intervals here. Always, always, always. 4-3, any Arabic numeral like this, whether it's a 6-4 chord, whether it's a 4-3 suspension, whatever, that's referring to the interval above the bass. Interval above the bass. So that's a 4-3 suspension in a really stripped down thing. Starts consonant, then instead of moving together, we hold the first note over top of the second note, second chord, and then resolve it down. 4-3 suspension. And it's a fourth above the bass to a third above the bass. Let's look at a little bit more of a built up situation here. Here we are in F major, right? And we're going from a 4 chord to this 1 chord. You can see that the sopranos have the suspension here. One beauty of the suspension is that in many cases, not all the time, but in many cases, and especially for us as we get going, they're always going to include a tie. So if we're analyzing music and you see a tie, that's a good hint that it's probably a suspension. So if we look at these two examples, they're both really wonderful. I love this second one in G minor. Just gorgeous. I just love these suspensions. So let's look at some characteristics here. The 4-3 suspension only happens over root position chords, right? It only happens over root position chords. And so if we look, we've got B flat here being held over. The original motion for this, right, was B flat to A, right? So if we didn't have a suspension, this would go ba da, 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 right? And F, this second chord, is root position. So we can do a 4-3 suspension. And part of the reason that we want to be so careful about the inversion is that it helps to keep really important interval relationships in mind, and it helps us with this idea that we mentioned previously, that the resolution note should not be doubled. So if we look here, this suspension pattern, remember, the initial note is the preparation. That note being held over or suspended is the suspension, right? So the suspension is over the new chord here. And then this is the resolution. A is the resolution. Now, if we look at that, I'm going to play right on beat 3 of this measure where the suspension is happening. If we look here, what's missing from this chord that the resolution is going to give us, right? If we look at the bass as the root, the tenors have the fifth, and the altos have the root. So on that beat, with the suspension, we've got no third. And so the 4-3 suspension, it's important that the resolution note isn't doubled because we want this to be the moment that the third of the chord is introduced, right? Same thing down here in minor. Hear the longing? Oh, man. Right? You just get right here, and you can just hear that chord being suspended. Man. And again, this is a 5 chord in G minor, root, 5th, root, with the 3rd being just not quite arriving at the right time. Now, 4/3 suspensions. This is important. Can be in any voice except for the bass. Now, the basses will get a little love down the line here, but not now. You got to be careful with giving basses love. It's a really complicated situation. So we just said, or we've been saying, that when we talk about 4/3, that refers to the intervals above the bass. So why is it, do you think, right away, that basses maybe can't have a 4/3 suspension? Well, they're not above anybody, right? You can't be a fourth above a voice if you're the lowest voice by definition. So the basses are kind of left out of the 4/3 fun. And as we've been saying, that resolution note needs to not be doubled, because in both of these examples, it's the fact that we can hear where it's gonna go, and it's gonna be awesome. And if somebody else was sort of chiming in already with that note, the withholding nature of the suspension wouldn't be as just wonderful, right? It wouldn't be so just filled with suspense and expectation. So that's the 4/3 suspension. Really, really, really quickly, I don't want to dwell on this much. Just to quickly come back to old friend, the cadential 6/4, and just sort of show how, here's our cadential 6/4. Right? If you need to review this is a great slide to just review the part writing of a 4th and a 6th, resolving to a 3rd and a 5th. Right? It's a 5 chord that's becoming a 5 chord. Now, I'm going to play the cadential 6/4 one more time, the left example. Right? Now, here's a cadence with a suspension instead. So that alto line, which is here on do, ba, da, da, da. See how the alto line is going from a 4th above the bass to a 3rd above the bass? That's a suspension, right? That's a 4/3 suspension, because F is a 4th above the bass, moving to a 3rd above the bass, which we know, coming back to the cadential 6/4, look, we said it's a 6 above the bass, which resolves to a 5th, and a 4th above the bass that resolves to a 3rd above the bass. Right, so this cadential 6/4 suspension sort of thing, they're really connected, and I hope that in that ever-present question of why are we calling the cadential 6/4 a 5 chord when it doesn't look like a 5 chord, well, this doesn't look like a 5 chord, right? We don't have all the right notes of a 5 chord, but yet we're still really comfortable with calling that 5 because we can hear and discern where that suspension is going. It's going to fulfill the full 5-ness of that motion. And what matters to our ears is the function, that we can tell this is dominant harmony because of the context. Same thing here. We can tell this is dominant harmony because of the context. Okay? All right, last thing for today. One more type of suspension. The 7/6 suspension. So, 4/3. Remember, go back to the 4/3. Those numbers refer to the intervals above the bass. Nothing is going to be different here with the 7/6. That still refers to the intervals above the bass. So we're going to find a 7th and a 6th, or a 7th that moves down to a 6th above the bass. And the motion is going to be the same. It's still ornamenting a descending second, all right? The main difference is that 7/6 suspensions occur over first inversion chords. Now, really quickly, why is it, do you think, that a 4/3 Why is it that a 7/6 suspension could not occur over a root position chord? What about these numbers doesn't match up with a root position chord? Well, we know that root position chords are built on a third and a fifth. 5/3, right? Third, fifth, 5/3. So there's no sixth for any note to resolve to in a root position chord. But first inversion chords are built on thirds and sixths, right? So there's a sixth for this suspension to resolve to. So that's sort of why there's this inversional sort of placement. Theoretically, 7/6 suspensions could happen over 6/4 chords, but I wouldn't recommend it. 6/4 chords have enough going on, right? Just because you can put something somewhere doesn't mean you should. You can put wasabi on every single thing that you eat. Doesn't mean you should. Okay, here we go. 7/6 suspension. We're in E flat. Apparently, there's no key signature here, so we're just going to pretend. I don't know what happened there. We're in E flat on a 1/6 chord, and here it comes. There's our 7/6 suspension in the alto line. So the altos are here on E flat. And I'm going to strip away the other voices. So just bass and soprano, and bass and alto in this case. When we get to the second beat, the E flat is going to stay. And then we've got F up to E flat, right? F to E flat. That's a 7th, which resolves down to a 6th. Now, I think 7/6 suspensions are just really gorgeous. Can you hear? Listen to that dissonance. The thickness of the sound. Listen to this suspension. How jam-packed it is. Man, it's gorgeous. Now, here's something really, really cool about the 7/6 suspension. That'll be the last thing I want to point out. When we look at this, it's labeled here as a 7/6 chord, okay? We're in E flat major despite the key signature. What's the root of 7 in E flat? What's the root of 7 in E flat? It's D, right? D is the root. This is going to be a D, F, A flat chord, 7 in the key of E flat. So what's unique about this 7/6 suspension? What note on the suspension is being withheld? It's the root. So we don't get the root of the chord until the resolution. That's just so beautiful. I just absolutely love that. And this, again, points to this idea of contextual function. We can kind of tell what this chord is even before the root is there because it's the motion and the expectation of the suspension figure. Our ears know where it's going to go even before it gets there, and we can piece together that information so that not only do we understand the harmonic context, but we can see into the future. I think with suspensions in particular, a lot of non-harmonic tones are like this. The joy in them and the thing that makes them sound so good to us is that we can hear where it's going. We can hear the resolution. We can hear it coming. This note has only got one place to go, and it's there. I think of this a lot like a great joke, especially rhyming jokes tend to work this way, where someone's telling it and you can hear the rhyme coming. And so you know what the punchline's going to be. You know what that rhyme is going to be. And it's going to be so good. And you just start laughing before you even get there because you can hear where this note is going to go. And it's so great. Right? That's a suspension. So we're going to keep working with those. There's more to unpack with suspensions, but this is just a way to sort of really lay out the basic techniques here. So let's keep working on them.